Hello, everyone, and welcome to the NeoSystems CMMC Town Hall. Now I'd like to introduce your host, Ed Bassett from NeoSystems. Ed?
Thanks, Don, and welcome everyone to our continuing series of Town Hall Ask Me Anything sessions on cybersecurity maturity model certification. My guest today is Malcolm Harkins, also Wade Forbes, drawing the notes from our conversation, which we'll send out after the session. I do want to mention to the audience that we are recording these sessions as part of our community outreach to the defense industrial base. Our focus at NeoSystems as a managed service provider is primarily on meeting the needs of organizations that are seeking certification. That's mostly who's in our audience today. If you're in the audience and you have some questions for Malcolm, please do send those in on the Q&A feature within Zoom, and I'll try to work those into the conversation. I'll start with an introduction of Malcolm. Malcolm Harkins is a CISO mentor and coach, as well as advisor and board member to companies in the cybersecurity sector. He's building off a career as the Chief Security and Trust Officer at Cymatic and Cylance, as well as being the Chief Security and Privacy Officer at Intel. Malcolm has a practitioner viewpoint on cybersecurity and looks at the risk decision-making process in a way that often challenges the status quo. So we're hoping to explore some of that today. Malcolm, thanks for joining us today.
Hey, thanks, Ed. Happy to be here.
So today we're going to talk about, how to manage security and risk in ways that are a little different than the compliance-driven approach that is too often where I think we get led by, regulations like CMMC. We have a lot of conversation on this series about how to hit the compliance buttons and make sure we get certification. I think, CMMC as an initiative is driving a lot of companies within the defense industrial base to really rethink their overall cyber strategy. Really, a lot amongst small and mid-sized companies that have historically been pretty inconsistent in how they implement cyber controls. So CMMC is the promise of it is to raise the cyber hygiene bar for about 300,000, maybe 350,000, depending on how you count, different companies that do work for the DoD. And for the most part, that sort of rethinking that those companies are doing involves shopping for new technology, new cloud services, new managed service providers. And it's really a crowded marketplace out there. So I just wanted to get your perspective as a participant in that cyber vendor sector, as a CISO. What's your view on the quality of choices that people have available to them right now?
Well, let's again go back to the compliance question first. So okay. For me, compliance is the residue or residual of good security and risk management. And so you can achieve compliance without having a good risk management program or a good level of security. So you should start with your risk management and security as the primary focus, and then have the outcome of that be being able to check the box on various compliance standards. Because if you start it the other way around, you're probably not going to end up in the destination that you want, other than you were able to check the box. Now, from a tool and vendor and service provider capability, we've all seen the stuff that there's 3,000 or 4,000 security tools out there, and there's countless service providers, and a lot of people moan and groan about that number and say it's too difficult to navigate the complexity of all those tools. I don't necessarily look at it that way, because none of us moan and groan about all the IT capabilities out there and how many devices and how many apps and all that. I think that's just the challenge of the IT environment is the plethora of choices that you have. I do think there are many of the choices out there, though, that are less than adequate. And what we should be doing is holding the vendor community accountable towards outcomes and not just listen to their marketing messages. And I think if you start doing that and really looking at the efficacy and efficiency of control and the approach that they're taking, you can find the right players. And that's where, since I left Intel, I've spent more time in the startup space, because there's a lot of old guard security companies. They've got some good capabilities in many cases, but they make their money off of milking the cash cow of something that they started 10 or 15 years ago, that it's dated in its approach and it's weak in its ability to control for risk. So I've tended more towards the startups where I can, because I think that they are moving the needle faster on the risk curves than the old guard security players.
So audience question that kind of fits into this, how do you navigate the complexity that's out there? The audience question is, where do I start with CMMC? I'm new to this field and basically clueless to start implementing it. So I think there's a piece of that that's, go read the regulation, but there's a piece of it that says, how do I start a security maturity journey? How do I take what I'm doing today and maybe make that more mature? What are your thoughts there?
Well, I think there's a few different ways to do it. I mean, one, understanding the regulations so that you're educated on it, it makes sense. But there are a number of consulting practices as well as tools out there that are automating, on the tool side, automating the CMMC steps so that you can improve your efficiency in walking towards a CMMC certification. Happen to be on a board of a company that does that, but I also know some consultants that are what I'll say CMMC coaches, right? Because they're more expert in it. It's if you go back in time, even my Intel days, Sarbanes-Oxley, right, came out of the blue. Public companies had to start complying with it within a couple of years. What did we do? We went and learned it a bit and then hired people that were more expert in that type of financial integrity and financial reporting compliance to kind of coach us along the path. And then once we got past the first year, we were able to turn the crank ourselves pretty efficiently. But I would look at it and I'd go find a reputable vendor that has, in essence, a business process automation that will guide you through the steps, and or a coach that's gone through the certification programs, and is basically a CMMC certified evaluator.
You can put in a plug for managed service providers too, if you want. That'd be
Yes.
great.
Yeah. No, you're exactly right. Because I think along that path, there's a few different ways to do it. But I do think getting somebody who has the bench strength and has done that learning will make that process a lot easier and a lot faster for you.
Agrees. Malcolm, you've written about a notion of expense in depth. So kind of playing on the defense in depth, the strategy, the tendency we have to maybe throw money at the cyber problem and hope that will fix things. Do you think regulations like CMMC are fueling this tendency by turning a whole catalog of controls into mandatory requirements? Or maybe the opposite, maybe they're helping us to spread our effort more broadly and avoid sort of target fixation on the threat of the day?
It's a good question. I think a little bit of both. Again, I think some of these regulations and compliance regimes are useful and they're necessary in some ways, but not sufficient, right? So that we can get a baseline of coverage to manage risk. So from that perspective, I like them, and I think it will, and it can and will move the needle. At the same time, I've seen and I've experienced, I haven't had hands-on experience with CMMC per se as a company who's had to go through it at this point, but I can tell you, I don't care if it's FedRAMP, PCI compliance, SOC 2, whatever. There's some of those historic compliance and other regimes like that point you towards dated control architectures that perpetuate the problem. I'll give you an example. And again, it was FedRAMP or payment card industry standard compliance, probably both. But there was, when I was at Cylance, using machine learning to try and mitigate the execution of malicious code, those compliance regimes asked me how often I updated my DAT and definition files, pointing towards traditional AV, which we knew was insufficient and a flawed control. So sometimes, depending upon how the auditor and how the compliance regimes are written, you're actually pointing yourself towards something that doesn't really effectively work, which then means your notion of defense in depth has become expense in depth, because when we start having control deficiencies, rather than fix the control that's not working, what we tend to do is, buy other things to make up for the deficiency in something that we are keeping in place, rather than changing the control or removing it. And so we've just continued to kind of add band-aids and bubblegum and baling wire to our security stack rather than re-architecting it with an eye towards the outcomes that we need to deliver. And that's what has caused the defense in depth becoming expense in depth, which is why most CISOs just continue to ask for more and more and more and more and more, because their existing controls are not working sufficiently.
So rather than just kind of stacking that up and hoping for goodness, you described the role of the CISO as kind of a choice architect. What do you mean by that concept, and how should they be thinking of those choices?
Yeah, so this came about actually extemporaneously back a few years ago. I was in Australia and having a Chatham House Rules dinner dialogue with a bunch of CIOs, CTOs, some CEOs. And one of the government folks in the room had asked me, a politician, how would I define my role as a chief information security officer, chief security officer? And I said, well, it's not that dissimilar from when I was in finance. And people kind of looked at me funny. I said, I'm a choice architect. I'm architecting choices for the business. Some of those choices I get to make. Some of them the CIO does. Some of them a business unit general manager does. Some of them the board does. But I am basically, there's risk, there's cost, there's impact on business velocity, there's impact on users and productivity. And depending upon how I frame those choices, as well as frame the risk perspectives, is it risk to the business? Is it risk to my customers? Is it potentially societal risk? Depending upon how you architect those discussions and that data, you make sometimes different choices and different decisions. So much like as a finance person, right? I'm return on investment, net income, margin, financial risk, loss. Those are all different ways in which you can portray a business decision. And depending upon how you portray it, you make one decision or another. It's no different in framing risk. It creates, it's like the aperture of a camera, right? You can focus in really tight, you can do wide angle, you can change the hues and contrast, you can point the direction. And depending upon how you do that aperture and color contrast, the viewer gets a different view, which will then alter how they internalize what you're showing them.
Drill a little bit to the sort of the language of those choices, right? So security people like to say security and compliance are not the same thing. Ideally, though, we want our effort to achieve both goals. You mentioned, compliance being the residual, right? Compliance under CMMC, very easy to evaluate. It's binary pass fail. You either have the certification or you don't have the certification. Security, on the other hand, is much harder to measure. So how do you like to evaluate security performance? Like when you're making those choices, you want to evaluate how you're performing. What's the language and the metric to use there?
Yeah, so for me, there's three macro outcomes that I think chief information security officers, chief security officers need to be measured on. And I've codified it in a couple of books I've written that I call my 9 box of risk. On the one scale, there's the risk scale. What is my risk and residual risk look like today? How much risk am I preventing? How much am I detecting? How much am I responding to? So you can get pretty point in time and backwards looking view of how you're doing on those type of things. But risk is temporal, so you also have to think out about future risk. Then there's total cost, getting to the notion of expense in depth. And it's total cost wasn't what my budget is. It's total cost to the business, right? Of the reaction cost, of the spending, on the inefficiencies it creates in other parts of the business, whether it be other parts of IT, on business velocity, the legal time to respond to different things. That's a total cost picture to the business. And then there's this view of what I call control friction, because controls are a drag coefficient. They slow down people, data, and business processes. And if you're introducing too much friction on the business, you're affecting cost, you're affecting time to market. And in many cases, at least from my experience, when the friction is too high, your users and business go around the control. In which case you've just spent money on a control that generated more risk because people went around the control. So there's three dimensions with which we need to be looking at how we're doing: risk, total cost, and control friction. And we need to be shrinking all of them, right? And because if we can lower risk, lower cost, and lower friction, that's what the organization would ideally want. And so we have to have the measurements that are constantly seeing all those things and finding out if we are managing all three of those dimensions, or maybe we're just managing the risk and cost is growing, exorbitantly. Former finance guy, cash is king. That's not attainable long-term. Or maybe we're managing cost and managing risk, but we've introduced so much control friction, the business is slowing down. That's a business problem.
That notion of people going around is very interesting. I think often left out of the discussion, right? Because it is a reality. Business often doesn't slow down. It goes around, right?
Yeah.
It's got a momentum of its own. So I want to circle back on a comment you made a minute ago about when you were at Cylance and, having to meet a requirement that said, update your .dat files once a day or whatever, and you have a whole new technology. So that's a case where you've got a technology that's ostensibly better than what was required by the standard, but it doesn't check the box of the way the standard was written. So what's your advice for those who find themselves getting out ahead of that? They're innovating, they think they're doing better security, but they're sideways to the compliance standard. How should they handle that?
Yeah, to be honest, I think it's a challenge. The traditional way is to do a compensating control analysis and basically prove that you're managing the risk. Now, the real rub on this, and I saw this, when in the organizations I've been into trying to sell into the federal government, right? You didn't have FedRAMP certification at the time. You didn't have this, you didn't have that. And the buyer on the FedGov side will go, well, you don't have that, so I can't buy it. And I'm like, well, it's a better control. Well, but you don't meet this compliance regime. Well, some of those government organizations will go get that, ATO, authority to operate, and go walk through the gauntlet that they have to basically bend the rules on the compliance regimes. Some of them won't. So I don't think there's an easy answer there other than you've got to look at the compensating control. You've got to make that case. And in some cases, again, I've had to do this at a couple cases. Again, it may have been FedRAMP or the Australian equivalent IRAP that I had to do, that they wanted a file integrity checking thing in the cloud, which was irrelevant given our control stack, but the auditor wouldn't get off of it. Well, I wasn't going to go spend money on a file integrity thing that wasn't going to matter. We got an open source one, stuck it in, and let the light blink, so that we could check the box on it, right? So I think there's ways in which you can navigate some check the box things that don't exhaust a lot of resources or money. You just got to get creative in doing it. And if you can't, if the compensating control doesn't work and you don't think the control is worthwhile, go find an open source tool or do some quick manual process that will check the box and keep moving.
That's good advice. And CMMC, the way it's written today, doesn't have a lot of wiggle room there. There's a notion of risk management, but there's no notion of risk acceptance by the people making the decisions. You either implemented the control or you didn't. So and I think some of that's still getting worked out in terms of how that's going to happen in practice. But I think people are not sure yet how that's going to be handled, because again, it's about the evaluation, the assessment regime, and how they apply interpretation of that static standard.
Totally agree, but let's also make sure everybody understands that accepting risk is a business process. It's not a control.
Yep.
Right, and so accepting risk and acceptable risk are also two different things. And acceptable to who? It might be acceptable to the business, but it might not be acceptable to your customer, right? So you have to think through, those are again choices depending upon how you architect that dialogue that reduces the confusion around those things.
That's good. Look, let me shift gears a little bit. I want to ask about the threat. We've seen really some amazingly sophisticated, coordinated efforts lately. We're all working hard to build operational maturity on the defender side, but the offense is pretty mature as well. I heard an NPR article yesterday on ransomware gangs. They were highlighting the fact that they have advanced customer service functions built to help, their victims enjoy really smooth ransom payment transactions. So they're, kind of imitating Amazon, the customer service method. Is threat innovation outpacing our security standards, do you think?
In reality, so let's go back to that crimeware as a service, ransomware as a service. I mean, frankly, that's been going on for 10, 15 years. It's grown up a little bit more, and it's now in the public venue and in the news cycles, but that's been happening for a long time, and the maturity of it's there, and it becomes pretty easy to go, rent, buy, utilize that stuff. I don't think it's, the reality is our controls in our organizations, they're not that sophisticated, believe it or not, right? I mean, it's not that hard to go get a credential, go use it. Like the SolarWinds CEO said, we didn't have multi-factor authentication on the VPN. That's how the breach occurred. Frankly, that's true, but frankly, that's also crap. You're telling me you didn't have any other controls other than one, and that one thing was the failure point, right? So this is where we're not doing a good enough job on really managing the risk issues. And some of that is because we've thinned ourselves out too much, because all we're doing is chasing vulnerabilities. And there's a difference between being vulnerable and being exploitable, right? You can have a vulnerability that has a low likelihood of being exploitable. Why? Because you have other good controls in place. That's why the notion of defense in depth, if done right, works, right? And so I think, it's up to us to own managing the risks in our environment. And our controllable variable in the risk equation is how vulnerable we are and how exploitable we are. And we're not doing a good enough job managing it. It's not a standards problem. It's the people in charge managing it to the outcomes that need to be done.
Gotcha. Yeah. So, well, speaking of the ransomware, that story that I heard, the announcement really was that the government has managed to claw back about half of the Colonial Pipeline ransom payment, which the government's excited about. It was a big coup, but Colonial's still out a few $1 million, and the adversary still has that money in their bank account. How do you advise companies on things like paying ransoms, and I guess maybe a more general side of the financial considerations and insurance and how that impacts security decision making?
Yeah, so I tell people, hopefully they've already done this. If they haven't, they should do it immediately. They should have a set of principles under which they are predefining, well ahead of being in the event, who the decision makers are, who has input in the decision to pay or not pay. They should look at their insurance policies, though that ends up being, a little bit of a challenge as well, as to whether or not you're going to get that, financial payback for the insurance coverage you get. But you need to look at all those things up front. It's hard to say pay or not pay, because there are some circumstances that I think require payment. There are other circumstances that I'd go absolutely not. And I'll give you a way to perhaps frame, again, getting back to a choice architect, how to make that decision. You don't know who's on the other end of the payment. And you might be funding, if you pay, somebody's doing human trafficking. You might be funding a terrorist. You might be funding a rogue nation state. And for people who think I'm a little bit blowing that out of proportion, that if you pay, you might be contributing to people getting killed. There was some work done years ago after the Mumbai bombing in 2008 that led to some conclusions that over $2 million of that physical terrorist attack came from cybercrime. So you always have to wonder if you're creating more societal harm and more harm to people if you pay. Then you have to weigh that against the impact of not paying because you didn't do a good enough job mitigating the risk up front. And again, if I was in a situation where again, this is why ransomware in hospitals and stuff like that was a big thing, right? If I had an emergency room, an operating room, and people were going to die if I didn't pay, I might make the payment, right? So, but if I'm just going to lose output in a factory because I was sloppy in what I was doing, and it's going to cost my business $50 million because I can't produce goods, but I might be paying, an organization that's going to kill people, I would eat the financial loss, and shame on me because I didn't do a good enough job managing the risk. But that's how I would frame the choices of pay or not pay.
Let me ask about trust and I guess what we trust and why. So when you worked at Intel and Cylance, specifically, you're focused on some very high trust products, right? These are products that are broadly relied upon to be trustworthy. The attack on SolarWinds, the big exploitation of Microsoft Exchange, these are events that really have sort of shaken our trust foundation. Our adversaries targeted products that are ubiquitous, that we trust in an implicit way, and they were really extraordinarily successful. So as consumers of big tech, how should we be thinking about those vendors and those products? Does trust get reestablished? Is there something that happens that lets us reestablish that? Or is there some new stance we adopt, assumed breach, zero trust, something like that, where we start to change the way we think of those products that we're buying and consuming?
Yeah, so again, going back into my Intel days, probably circa 2005, 2006, my emerging threat and intelligence team and our team looking at things out, we looked at trust becoming the attack surface. Why? Because if you trust it, you shut off your evaluation of risk, right? You just blindly trust it and you keep moving. So I've had a notion of trust becoming the attack surface for a long time. Now let's talk to the fact that you can't eliminate risk, just like we can't eliminate it physically, you can't eliminate it in financial markets. Heck, even holding cash, you face inflation risk, right? So you can't eliminate risk under any circumstance. So now let's define trust. Trust is a function of two things: competence and character. Competence is the capabilities you demonstrate, the results you deliver. So you need to evaluate big tech, your security vendors, every solution provider you have on their competencies. Are they demonstrating that they are competent in what they are doing? Again, recognizing you can't eliminate risk. And then the other one is intent, which is integrity. How does that vendor, how does big tech make money? And if they make more money by sweeping under the rug security issues, and they've demonstrated that they're not on top of the management of risk, then you shouldn't trust them. And so that's how I measure risk with or trust with people, with technology, and where you can go beyond the third-party risk questionnaires. Again, that's a check the box type of thing. It'll get you a baseline, but it really won't provide a strong basis of trust. Where you have critical vendors that could cause an extinction event for your organization, meaning a lot of pain, a lot of suffering, maybe you go out of business, something that really hurts bad, establish a direct relationship with the chief security officer, chief information security officer. Have that type of trusted relationship. That's what I did at Intel with my key vendors. That's what I did at Cylance with my key vendors. And that's also what I did with Cylance's customers. I knew my peer, and I knew whether or not I trusted them based upon their competencies as well as their integrity. And that meant more to me than the third-party risk questionnaire.
Good advice. I've got two sort of related audience questions I want to work in. One is about the role of government in all this. So things like software bill of materials, consumer labeling. We've seen some of this all in the executive order that came out a couple of weeks ago. What do you recommend that the government should do to incentivize private sector or vendor participation, both in planning and implementation, is the question.
I certainly many things in the EO are fantastic, and I think that they need to get implemented. It's going to come down to how they get implemented as to whether or not it really moves the needle, like with anything. I do believe that, more broadly, think of Energy Star rating, think of crash ratings on cars. There was Senator Markey back a few years ago, a week or so after I had got done providing testimony to the U.S. Senate on the promise and perils of emerging technology, proposed cybersecurity. I can't remember the exact thing, but it was basically like an Energy Star rating that would make it easier for general consumers to understand the effort and efficacy of technology relative to its, crash rating, right, for security. I think those things are absolutely necessary, and the government should do something like that in order to promote and create a brand differentiation that will create then the incentives for the creators of technology to do a better job. I think the other thing that the government should do, and again, I hate regulation, but at the same time, it's necessary. Think of Sarbanes-Oxley and why that happened in the early 2000s. And we haven't eliminated fraud. We haven't eliminated, CFOs, CEOs, and other businesses from playing with the books. But by and large, we haven't had any financial integrity issues for a long time. I think we could do something like a Sarbanes-Oxley and create a cybersecurity integrity law that the executives of an organization, including the CISO, has to attest to the fact that they are managing their systems where, to the best of their ability, they don't believe material or significant harm could come out of the use of those systems. And the creators of technology should do that same type of attestation to the security development lifecycle. We believe that we've done sufficiently enough that material harm could not come out of the creation of technology we've done. If we did those things, we would create the right liability incentives, financial incentives, and then we also need to hold the security industry culpable for the problem as well, and have the FTC go after many of them for false advertising claims. And we should be doing attribution to the controls that failed in any large public breach. And where a vendor has provided that control and it didn't work, we should call it out. That will also change the economic incentives to the security industry to do a better job with the solutions they're providing.
We're kind of at the end of our time, but I want to squeeze in this one last question. It's a fairly straightforward one about phishing simulation and user education. So are phishing simulation tools effective in user training and user education, or any other best practices to bring employees along in their cyber education?
I think they're useful, but at the same time, I hate blaming a user, right? If a user opens up an attachment, clicks on a link, and something bad happens, that's the failure in technology to protect them and protect the organization. And so let's not use the phishing to blame the user, the phishing training to blame the user. We should do that general awareness. Don't talk to strangers, be cognizant of what you're doing and all that type of stuff. But if it's used as a weapon to blame the user and deflect accountability from the IT team and the security team from doing their job adequately, then we're using it the wrong way.
Malcolm, thanks. This was a really good session. We are kind of over time. If I was on live TV, I'd be fired by now. I think, but thank you very much. Thanks to the audience for some really good questions. Please do join us for future town hall meetings. Next week, our guest is going to be Peter Dome. He's the CISO of Battelle Corporation, and the topic's going to be endpoints and specifically bring your own device, BYOD, under CMMC. So that should be a very interesting session. I will be not moderating. I'm going to have a guest moderator as well, since I'm teaching a class that conflicts with the town hall. But that's going to be at our usual time of Wednesday, June 16th at 1 o'clock Eastern. Please join us for that session with Peter Dome. Thanks, everybody, and have a good day.